My dad's words still echo in my head like a slammed door that never stops rattling in its frame. "You're no daughter of mine. If you want answers, talk to my lawyer." It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a heated slip of the tongue. It was cold, deliberate, and final. I remember standing in his study, the smell of his old leather-bound books, the half-empty glass of bourbon on his desk, the blinds half closed so slivers of sunlight cut across his face like prison bars. He didn't even raise his voice. Didn't even look me in the eye as he disowned me. Just a casual flick of the wrist toward the phone where his lawyer's number was scribbled on a yellow post-it. And in that moment, my whole body went numb, because deep down, I had known something like this was coming. My father was the kind of man who loved control more than he loved people. For years, he used money as a leash, dangling promises of inheritance, of security, of approval, but always with strings attached, always conditional. I thought if I worked hard, if I made him proud, if I bent myself into whatever shape he demanded, maybe I'd earn my place in his world. Instead, I found myself cut off like a branch he no longer wanted on his family tree. What I didn't know then, standing in that suffocating silence, trying not to break, was that walking into his lawyer's office would not just reveal the truth about his will, it would ignite a chain of events that none of us could stop. My father thought he had written me out of his life. He had no idea that the words in his own carefully crafted will would turn against him. And that's where my story really begins. I didn't cry that night, though I wanted to. I sat in my car in his driveway, staring at the neat rows of rose bushes my mother used to prune before she died, and I realized this was the moment he'd been preparing me for all along. My father was a man obsessed with legacy, not love, not connection, not warmth, but legacy. He measured everything in assets and appearances. To him, family was not about blood, but about loyalty to his rules, obedience to his vision. He built an empire from the ground up, starting with nothing but a secondhand truck and a stubborn will. He liked to remind everyone of that fact, that he didn't inherit a dime, that every brick in his empire bore the weight of his own two hands. And yet, somehow, for a man who claimed to value hard work above all else, he dismissed mine like it was worthless. I had worked my way through law school without taking a cent from him, but to him, it was a failure because I hadn't done it his way, hadn't taken the path he chose. He wanted me to stay close, to marry someone from his circle, to take on a role in the company he'd molded into his kingdom. Instead, I became independent, which in his eyes was nothing less than betrayal. That night, I remembered all the little cracks that had been forming for years. The way he dismissed my ideas at family dinners, mocking them like a teacher scolding a child. The way he held my brother up as a shining example, even though he coasted through life on the back of my father's money. The way he told me once, straight-faced, "I didn't raise you to be your own person, I raised you to be mine." I laughed it off then, because what else could I do? But sitting there, with the silence pressing against the car windows and the taste of iron in my throat, it didn't feel funny anymore. It felt like prophecy. The next morning, I walked into the office of his lawyer, a man I'd only ever seen, hovering in the background of my father's business dinners. His name was Mr. Caldwell, a tall man with thinning white hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He looked at me over his glasses as though I were an inconvenience. Another piece of paperwork on his already cluttered desk. He didn't offer sympathy, didn't even acknowledge the drama that had led me there. Instead, he slid a thick folder across the polished mahogany desk and said, "Your father has made his wishes very clear. You'll want to read this carefully." Seemed the wow. Folder was heavier than I expected, the kind of weight that seemed to press down on me even before I opened it. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages, skimming legal jargon that made my stomach twist. And then, there it was, the will. Black ink on white paper, my father's neat signature at the bottom of every page, like a seal of condemnation. As I read, I felt the air leave my lungs. He had disowned me officially, written me out as though I had never existed. Every asset, every property, every share of his company was to go to my brother. My name appeared only once, attached to a clause that seemed almost mocking in its precision. I was to receive any personal items deemed of sentimental but negligible financial value. Negligible. That word burned itself into my brain. But then, halfway through the document, I found something odd. A clause that seemed almost out of place. It referred to a trust established years ago, back when my mother was still alive. My father had drawn it up with her, and unlike the rest of the will, this clause had not been altered since her death. My name was on it, and not just as a footnote. It stated that upon my father's passing, I was entitled to a significant percentage of his holdings in a company I had never even heard of, a subsidiary buried beneath layers of shell corporations and mergers. Caldwell cleared his throat when I looked up at him, his expression unreadable. "Your father may have overlooked that detail," he said carefully, as if weighing every word. In that moment, something inside me shifted. My father had spent years trying to erase me, to make me feel small, dependent, unnecessary. But here, in his own hand, in a document he had signed and sealed, was proof that he couldn't. Whether he knew it or not, whether he liked it or not, I was woven into his legacy. He thought he was cutting me out of his world, but his own arrogance, his own obsession with control, had left a crack in the armor. And I was going to use it. Walking out of that office, clutching the folder like a lifeline, I felt the first spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Power. My father thought he had buried me under his will, but all he had done was plant me in soil he didn't realize was fertile. He had disowned me, but he hadn't destroyed me. And when the time came, he would learn just how dangerous it is to underestimate the daughter he tried to erase. I didn't tell anyone at first, not even my closest friends, about what I had found in that will. I knew my father, and I knew his world. Information was currency, and the second I revealed that clause, the war would begin. I spent nights sitting at my kitchen table, the folder spread out in front of me, highlighting terms, cross-referencing sections, making notes on sticky pads that covered my walls like a detective chasing a case. That clause, buried in the legal weeds, was the only leverage I had ever had against him. I needed to understand it fully before I made my move. I dug into the history of the company listed there, an old manufacturing firm my father had acquired decades ago. One that had been quietly folded into the family business under a different name. It was boring on the surface. Warehouses, supply contracts, patents no one cared about anymore. But when I traced the ownership structure, the numbers shocked me. Hidden under all the corporate shells and name changes, that company wasn't small. It was thriving, with international contracts, government deals, and a valuation that made my head spin. And according to the will, 30% of it was mine. Unalterable because my mother's signature had locked it in. I remembered her then. The way she used to sit with me at the piano, teaching me scales while my father barked orders on the phone in the next room. She was softer, quieter, but never weak. I think she knew what kind of man my father was, what he would try to do once she was gone. That clause felt like her hand, reaching forward through time, tucking something into my pocket when I wasn't looking, whispering, "You'll need this one day." It broke me a little to realize she had been right. The next weeks blurred into a haze of strategy. I called in favors from law school colleagues, people who owed me for late-night study sessions and mock trial coaching. I got advice without revealing. Too much, asking hypothetical questions about irrevocable trusts and subsidiaries. I spent hours in libraries, poring over dusty legal journals, learning how airtight a mother's co-signature could be. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. My father couldn't touch that clause without unraveling his entire empire. If he tried, he'd risk lawsuits, audits, exposure. For a man obsessed with control, it was the one place he had none. Meanwhile, I watched his moves from the outside. My brother, smug and untouchable, started flaunting his new role as the sole heir. He'd post pictures on social media of meetings in Dad's office, captioned with things like "carrying on the legacy." Friends whispered to me at parties that my brother was already talking about renovations to the main house, already making plans to modernize the company. They looked at me with pity, some with poorly hidden satisfaction. It was like everyone had agreed I was finished, and I let them think it. I smiled, nodded, congratulated my brother, played the role of the discarded daughter who had no fight left in her. All the while, I was memorizing their words, their attitudes, storing away the evidence of just how easily they believed I could be erased. The breaking point came at a family dinner, one of those stiff, formal affairs my father insisted on hosting every month. The long oak table, the expensive wine, the clinking silverware, all of it staged like a performance. That night, my father gave a little speech about the future of the family, with my brother beaming at his side, his hand resting on the chair my mother used to occupy. My father never once looked at me. When the toast ended, my brother leaned across the table with a smirk and said, "Don't worry, sis. Maybe I'll save you a job in the PR department when I'm running things." Laughter erupted from a few of the cousins, and for a moment, the humiliation was so sharp it felt like my skin might split. But I didn't flinch. I just smiled, raised my glass, and said, "That's generous of you, although you might want to hold off on promising positions until you've read the will thoroughly. Wouldn't want to get ahead of yourself." The table went silent. My father's fork froze halfway to his mouth. My brother's face drained of color. He tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked just enough to betray him. In that pause, in that flicker of panic in their eyes, I knew. They didn't know. They had missed the clause. The trap was still hidden, and I held the key. After that dinner, everything shifted. My father started calling me again, short-clipped conversations where he pretended nothing had happened, asking vague questions about whether I'd been in touch with Caldwell lately. My brother stopped posting pictures from the office. Rumors began to spread that my father was redrafting certain documents, scrambling to tighten holes. But it was too late. The clause was ironclad. The more they scrambled, the more power I felt returning to me, drop by drop. For once, they were reacting to me instead of the other way around. I wish I could say it was just about the money, but it wasn't. It was about finally being seen. Finally having proof that no matter how hard my father tried to erase me, he couldn't. My mother had made sure of that, and I wasn't going to waste the chance she gave me. The weeks that followed were some of the strangest of my life, because on the surface nothing changed, but underneath everything had shifted. My father still occupied his leather chair at the head of the table, still held court at family gatherings, still strode through his empire like a king convinced his crown would never slip. But I knew something he didn't want me to know. The ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he thought. It was almost surreal to watch him, this man who had controlled every breath of my life, carry on as if the trap wasn't already closing. I kept playing my part, the quiet daughter, the overlooked one, careful not to reveal too much too soon. And all the while, I dug deeper into that clause. I learned that the subsidiary, the one my mother's signature had locked in, wasn't just valuable, it was crucial. Hidden away, it owned several patents that the larger company relied on, patents that generated millions in licensing fees every year. If someone controlled that company, they could, in theory, choke the flow of money to the rest of the empire. My father had never expected me to notice it, let alone understand its importance. But I did. And once I realized the scope of what I held, I knew this wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was leverage. It was the one weapon in a lifelong war where I'd always been unarmed. I started visiting the office of that company quietly, under the radar. The first time I walked into their building, a nondescript gray structure on the edge of town, I expected to find dust and silence. Instead, I found a bustling operation. People who had no idea the quiet daughter of their distant owner had. Just stepped into their world. I introduced myself simply as a legal consultant, nothing more, and asked for some financial reports. They handed them over without a second thought, and I spent nights combing through them, my heart racing with every discovery. The numbers were staggering. Not only was the subsidiary profitable, it was more stable than many of the flashy ventures my father and brother loved to flaunt. And buried in those reports, I saw the truth. The company could survive without the larger empire, but the empire couldn't survive without it. It was almost poetic. The piece my father had overlooked, the piece he had deemed too small to matter, was the one that could unravel him. I remembered being a child, sitting on the staircase while my parents argued late at night. My mother's voice had been quiet, but firm. My father's loud and sharp. She once said, "You think strength is about building something big? But real strength is about protecting the part no one sees, the part that matters when everything else falls apart. I hadn't understood it then, but now I did. She'd been talking about me. The pressure started to mount when my father finally realized something was wrong. Caldwell called me one afternoon, his voice unusually tight, and said, "Your father is displeased with certain interpretations of the will. He'd like to meet with you, privately." I almost laughed at the word displeased, as though my father had just discovered a stain on his shirt, rather than a legal noose tightening around his empire. But I agreed, because I wanted to see his face when he tried to wriggle out of it. The meeting took place in his study, the same room where he'd disowned me weeks before. He sat behind his desk, the blinds drawn tight this time, the glass of bourbon replaced with a thick stack of papers. He didn't bother with small talk. "You've been digging," he said flatly. His eyes, once cold and dismissive, were sharp now, calculating. "That clause was an oversight. It was never meant to stand. Caldwell will work with you to arrange a buyout. Something fair. You'll sign, you'll take the money, and you'll stay out of the company's affairs. The old me, the daughter, who always bent, who always took scraps and called them meals, might have nodded, but not anymore." I leaned forward, my voice steady. "No, Dad. I'm not selling. I'm not signing. This isn't an oversight. This is my mother's signature. Her last safeguard, and I won't undo it." His face darkened, and for the first time in my life, I saw something that looked like fear flicker across his features. It was gone in an instant, replaced by anger, but I had seen it, and that gave me more strength than I could have imagined. The shouting started then, my father raising his voice in a way I hadn't heard since I was a teenager. He called me ungrateful, naive, reckless. He said I was endangering everything he had built, that I didn't understand the responsibility of legacy. But I did understand. I just didn't agree with his definition of legacy anymore. To him, it was about control, about ownership. To me, it was about finally breaking free of the stranglehold he'd kept on me my whole life. I didn't shout back. I didn't cry. I just let him rage. And when he was done, I stood up, smoothed my dress, and said, "We're not doing this your way anymore." Then I walked out. That was the night I stopped being afraid of him. And it was also the night I realized the fight wasn't over, because my father wasn't the type of man to accept defeat quietly. He would come after me through lawyers, through intimidation, through whispers in the family. But I had something he didn't: the truth, the law, and the memory of my mother standing beside me even though she was gone. For the first time, I felt ready. The war he started when he disowned me was only beginning, and this time, I wasn't the one unarmed. After that night in his study, I stopped waiting for my father's approval and started preparing for battle. I knew him too well to think he would let it go. He was a man who didn't just build walls, he built fortresses, and when one crack appeared, he would try to bury it under concrete. The next few weeks became a blur of phone calls, emails, and quiet meetings in coffee shops with people I trusted. I hired an independent lawyer, someone my father didn't know, someone with no ties to his world. Her name was Dana, sharp as glass with a calm confidence that made me feel like I wasn't fighting alone anymore. She read the documents, combed through every line, and when she looked up from the papers, her lips curved in the faintest smile. "He can't touch this," she said. "Not without destroying himself. Your mother locked this down tighter than a vault. It's yours." That one sentence became my anchor. I carried it in my mind like a shield every time doubt tried to creep in. Meanwhile, my father's pressure escalated. First came the phone calls, polite at first. Reminders that family was more important than contracts, that we could work something out if I was willing to be reasonable. Then came the guilt trips, delivered through my aunts and cousins, all rehearsed lines about how I was tearing the family apart, how my mother would have wanted peace, how my brother was under so much stress already. I listened quietly, but inside I seethed, because I knew my mother's voice better than any of them. And she would never have wanted me to fold under his thumb. Then came the threats, subtle but unmistakable. A cousin's husband lost his job at a company connected to my father. A landlord suddenly raised my rent. Old friends began to avoid me, afraid of losing business opportunities if they stayed close. It was his way of tightening the net, showing me that even outside his house, his reach was long, but the more he tried to crush me, the stronger my resolve became. For years, I had been the quiet one, the obedient one, the forgotten one. Now I was the one holding the piece he couldn't afford to lose, and I wasn't going to hand it back. The turning point came when Dana suggested we make it official, file paperwork asserting my rights over the subsidiary. If you stay in the shadows, he controls the narrative, she explained. But if you put your name on the record, it forces him to acknowledge you publicly. He hates exposure more than anything. She was right. My father thrived in private power, in closed doors and whispered deals. Dragging this into the open would be like turning on the lights in a room full of roaches. So we filed. Quietly, firmly, legally. And just like that, the silence broke. The day after the filing became public record, my phone lit up with messages. Some from relatives pretending to check in while clearly fishing for information. Some from people I hadn't heard from in years, suddenly eager to reconnect. And then, the one I had expected but dreaded, a message from my brother. It was short, sharp, and venomous. You don't know what you're doing. Pull back before you regret it. For a moment, the old fear tugged at me. The fear of being alone, of being painted as the villain in my own family. But then I remembered the smirk on his face at that dinner table, the way he had basked in my humiliation. No, I wasn't pulling back. Not now. Not ever. When the next family dinner came, I almost didn't go. But something in me wanted to see them, wanted to look my father and brother in the eyes and let them know I wasn't backing down. The room felt different this time. The air was heavy, conversation stilted. My father's usual performance, the grand speeches, the toasts, the subtle jabs, was gone. Instead, he was quiet, controlled, his eyes on me like a hawk watching prey. My brother, on the other hand, was restless, tapping his fork against his plate, shifting in his seat like he was sitting on needles. At one point, he leaned close and muttered, "You're making a mistake. Dad will bury you." I turned to him, my voice calm. Then he'll have to bury himself too. For the first time in years, he didn't have a comeback. He just stared, his mouth half open. And then he looked away. That silence was louder than any argument. It told me he knew the truth. I wasn't the same sister he used to mock. I wasn't the girl who could be dismissed with a smirk. I was someone he would have to reckon with. What I didn't realize, sitting at that table with the weight of 100 stares pressing down on me, was that this was only the beginning. My father wasn't going to give up control of his empire without a fight. He was already planning his next move, pulling strings I couldn't see yet. But for once, I wasn't afraid of the shadows. I had light now. I had proof. I had power. And most importantly, I had something he could never take back. The will of my mother, written in ink he couldn't erase. The real war began once the paperwork I filed started making waves outside the family. Business journals picked up on it first. Small articles tucked into the back pages about an unexpected shareholder asserting rights in one of my father's lesser-known companies. At first, it didn't seem like much. But those little articles spread, and soon the questions followed. Who was I? What did this mean for the company's future? Why had no one heard my name before? My father hated nothing more than questions he hadn't planted himself. And suddenly, the narrative wasn't his anymore. He tried to drown it out with noise, press releases about the strength of the family business, interviews where he spoke about legacy and unity, photo ops with my brother shaking hands with important partners. But the more he tried to pretend, the more obvious the cracks became. Analysts began digging into the filings, pointing out the trust clause that no one had noticed before. Some even praised it, calling it a masterstroke of foresight from my mother's era. That part stung and soothed at the same time, because while my father worked to erase me, the world was beginning to see her wisdom shining through. Behind closed doors, his tactics turned ruthless. He sent lawyers with offers, bigger sums each time, wrapped in velvet words about protecting the family. At one point, he had Caldwell deliver an envelope to my apartment, a check with more zeros than I had ever seen in my life. The note attached said, "And this now." I sat staring at it for hours. That kind of money could have changed everything for me. Security, freedom, peace. But I knew what it really was. A bribe to vanish, to sell my mother's safeguard back to the man who wanted me erased. I ripped the check in half and mailed it back in silence. That silence didn't last long. The next phase was intimidation. Strange cars parked on my street at night, phone calls that hung up the second I answered, an accidental break-in at my office where nothing was stolen except a copy of the documents I'd left on my desk. My father wanted me to feel hunted, cornered, small. And yes, there were nights I lay awake, my heart pounding, wondering if I had pushed too far. But every time doubt crept in, I heard my mother's voice again, reminding me she had signed that clause for a reason. If I gave it up now, I wouldn't just be betraying myself, I'd be betraying her. Dana stayed by my side through it all, her calm presence steadying me when the pressure felt unbearable. She began assembling a team. Not just lawyers, but investigators, accountants, people who could peel back the layers of my father's empire and expose what was hiding underneath. What we found was uglier than I expected. Shell companies hiding debts, offshore accounts funneling money, contracts that skirted legality. My father's kingdom wasn't as pristine as he liked to claim, and the more we uncovered, the more dangerous. It became for him to fight me openly. If he pushed too hard, too publicly, the whole rotten structure might come crashing down. And yet, he still tried. The confrontation that defined everything happened on a rainy Thursday evening when he showed up at my apartment unannounced. He had never stepped foot in my home before. It was beneath him. But there he was, standing in my doorway, drenched from the storm, his eyes burning with fury I had never seen so raw. He didn't ask to come in. He pushed past me, dripping water, on the floor, pacing like a caged animal. "You don't understand what you're playing with," he snapped. "You think this is about you? This is about survival. Do you know how many people rely on me? Do you know what happens if this company fractures?" I stood there, clutching the back of a chair to keep my hands steady. "Maybe they shouldn't have to rely on one man's ego," I said quietly. He froze, staring at me as though I'd spoken blasphemy. Then he slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing through the apartment. "You're my daughter," he hissed. "You don't fight me. You follow me." But that was the moment I finally understood the truth. I wasn't his daughter. Not in the way he defined it. I wasn't an extension of his power, a pawn in his legacy, a name he could write and erase at will. I was my mother's daughter. I was the woman who had survived his control, who had built her own strength in the shadows, who now held the piece of his empire he could never reclaim. And I told him so. My voice didn't shake when I said, "No, Dad, I don't follow you anymore." He left that night without another word, the storm swallowing him as he disappeared into the darkness. But I knew it wasn't over. He would regroup, strategize, find another angle. The war wasn't done, but something in his eyes before he turned told me he had finally realized. I wasn't the one who should be afraid anymore. After that stormy night when he left my apartment, dripping rain and rage onto my floorboards, the air around me felt permanently charged, as though lightning still hovered in the clouds. I knew he wouldn't stop. He couldn't. My father wasn't built to lose, and the fact that I had slipped through his fingers by means of his own, carelessness by a clause he hadn't noticed, was a humiliation he could never forgive. The days that followed became a study in pressure. Every morning I woke up braced for the next hit. Some were subtle, letters from banks suddenly questioning accounts I'd held for years, colleagues whispering that their firms were told working. With me might cost them contracts, even my landlord suggesting maybe I should consider finding a place more suitable for someone in my position. It was my father's style, indirect but suffocating, squeezing every corner of my life until I felt the air thinning. And yet, I didn't break. Each attack only made me more determined to dig deeper, to use the very tools he had weaponized against. Me, Dana became not just my lawyer, but my ally, my strategist, my shield. She taught me how to respond without reacting emotionally, how to counter a bank's letter with legal precision, how to document every intimidation attempt, how to make a record so detailed that it could later stand as a fortress in itself. We built files, timelines, a paper trail so undeniable that even my father's influence couldn't erase it. The The turning point came when Dana introduced me to a forensic accountant, a quiet man named Harris, with a gift for following money trails no one else could see. What he uncovered made my stomach knot and my pulse race. Millions funneled offshore, deals structured to avoid taxes, partnerships with names that raised more than eyebrows. It was the empire stripped bare, ugly, and rotten at its core. Harris showed me how the subsidiary I now partly controlled wasn't just important. It was central. It funneled patents, licensing fees, and royalties upward, propping up ventures that would otherwise collapse. Without it, my father's empire was a house of cards. With me holding 30%, I wasn't just a nuisance. I was a threat to its very foundation. The first time I realized how real that threat was came during a board meeting I wasn't supposed to attend. My father thought he could shut me out, but legally, with my stake, I had every right to be there. I walked into that glass-walled room filled with men in suits, their chatter faltering when they saw me. My father's jaw tightened, my brother's smirk wavered. I took my seat at the long table, laid out my documents, and for the first time in my life, I spoke with authority in a room where I had once been invisible. I asked questions about contracts, pointed out discrepancies Harris had found, pressed on deals that seemed questionable. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was seismic. Because in that silence, they all realized I wasn't bluffing. I knew things. I had receipts, and my father could no longer pretend I was irrelevant. That night, my brother confronted me in the parking garage. His face was flushed, his voice low but seething. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" he spat. "You're going to burn everything down." I looked at him, this man who had always been handed the world, who had never worked a day without my father's safety net. And I said, maybe it needs to burn. Maybe it's the only way something honest can grow. For a second, I saw fear. In his eyes, too. Not for me, but for himself. He had built his entire identity on being the heir, the chosen one. Without the empire, he was nothing. And he knew it. Meanwhile, the pressure outside the boardroom intensified. Journalists began circling, some sniffing for scandal, others genuinely curious about the daughter no one had known existed in the business world. I gave no interviews, stayed quiet, but the speculation worked in my favor. Silence can be powerful when the other side is desperate to control the story. My father scrambled to paint me as unstable, bitter, ungrateful. Leaks began appearing. In the press. False stories about my personal life. Whispers about debts I didn't have, relationships I wasn't in. He was trying to destroy my credibility before I could destroy his. But every lie only fueled my resolve. I didn't need to play his game. I just needed to hold the line until the truth broke through. The breaking point came with a letter from his lawyers. An ultimatum. Sign over my rights to the subsidiary in exchange for a payout triple the last offer, or face a court battle that would drain me of resources and reputation. Dana read it, folded it neatly, and looked me dead in the eye. This is desperation. He knows he's losing. If you want to end this, now's your moment. But if you want justice, not just for you, but for every year he tried to erase you, then we fight. I thought of my mother then, of her soft hands guiding mine over piano, keys, of her quiet strength in a house where her voice was always overshadowed by his thunder. She had left me this weapon, not so I could cash out and disappear, but so I could finally stand tall in a world where he had always tried to keep me small. And I knew what I had to do. I told Dana, we fight. And when the words left my mouth, I felt something shift inside me, like a chain snapping after years of tightening. I wasn't the daughter he had disowned anymore. I wasn't the ghost of his empire haunting its edges. I was the crack in its foundation, the one thing he couldn't. Control, the proof that even kings can bleed. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of losing him, because I realized I had already lost him long ago. What I stood to gain now wasn't his approval. It was my freedom, and I was ready to take it, no matter how long the war dragged on. The court battle stretched on like a war fought in slow motion, each filing and hearing another bullet fired across the battlefield. My father threw everything he had at me, teams of lawyers, endless motions, attempts to delay, intimidate, overwhelm. He thought his money and his influence would crush me, that eventually I'd run out of energy or courage or both. But he underestimated two things: the law my mother had locked into place, and the fire he had lit in me the moment he disowned me. The courtroom became the stage where our family's private war was dragged into the light. I'll never forget the first day I walked in, the heavy oak doors swinging open, reporters clustered outside, the air buzzing with whispers. My father sat at the front with his army of attorneys, his suit immaculate, his expression carefully carved into disdain. My brother hovered just behind him, pale and nervous, no longer smirking. And then there was me, alone at my table except for Dana, who looked like she could take on the world with nothing more than her pen. The opening arguments were like knives. My father's lawyers painted me as an opportunist, a bitter daughter, trying to claw at an empire I hadn't built. They emphasized his legacy, his sacrifices, his vision. They tried to erase me with words the same way he had tried to erase me with his will. But when it was our turn, Dana stood and calmly began unraveling their narrative, laying out the trust clause with precision, pointing to my mother's signature like a ghostly witness standing in the room with us. "This isn't about greed," she said. "This is about honoring the one voice in this family who was silenced too soon. This is about a promise written in ink that no amount of intimidation can erase." Piece by piece, we presented the evidence. The subsidiary's patents, the financial reports, the board minutes, all proving that my father's empire relied on the very company he had tried to bury in paperwork. And with every document, every fact, I watched the mask on his face crack. Just a little more. He had built his power on fear and secrecy, but in the bright light of the courtroom, those tools failed him. The most powerful moment came when Dana introduced a letter we had found in my mother's belongings, one she had written to the board years ago, requesting that the trust remain untouched for my benefit. Her words were simple, quiet, but they cut deeper than any argument. My daughter deserves to have a place that cannot be taken from her. I felt the tears sting my eyes as it was read aloud, and for once I didn't hide them. I wanted the judge, the jury, everyone in that room to see them, because they weren't weakness, they were truth. My father's lawyers tried to object, tried to spin, but it was too late. The tide had shifted, and when my father himself was called to the stand, his arrogance did the rest. He couldn't help. Himself, he ranted, contradicted his own attorneys, even admitted he had considered buying me out just to keep me quiet. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. He thought he was showing strength, but what he really showed was fear. In the end, the judge's ruling was clear. The trust clause stood, my ownership was valid, and any attempt to circumvent it would be unlawful. I won. The verdict didn't come with applause or fireworks, just the quiet bang of a gavel that echoed like thunder in my chest. My father sat frozen, his face drained, his empire cracked wide open by the very daughter he had tried to erase. My brother looked at me across the room, his expression a mix of anger and something else. Respect, maybe, or the dawning realization that the game had changed forever. Walking out of that courthouse, the cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward me, I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The story was already written, not just in headlines, but in history. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't powerless. I was my mother's daughter, carrying the part of the legacy he could never take back. And as I stood on the courthouse steps, the autumn wind lifting my hair, I realized something I never thought I would. I wasn't just free of him. I was finally free of needing him. The man who disowned me had given me the greatest gift of all. By trying to erase me, he forced me to carve my own name into stone. And now, no matter what he did next, it would never be erased again. When the dust of the courtroom finally settled and the lawyers packed up their papers, when the reporters moved on to the next scandal, and the gossip faded from dinner tables, I was left standing in a life I barely recognized, one that finally belonged to me. For months I had lived in a constant storm, measuring each day by the next attack from my father, the next attempt to corner me, silence me, erase me. But now, in the quiet that followed victory, I began to understand what freedom truly felt like. It wasn't loud. It wasn't triumphant parades or champagne toasts. It was the stillness of waking up in the morning and knowing I didn't have to flinch at the sound of my phone. It was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and realizing the air didn't feel heavy anymore. Of course, my father didn't disappear overnight. Men like him don't simply vanish when they lose. He retreated into silence, into the shadows where his pride could lick its wounds. He still controlled much of his empire, still had people who bowed to him, still had wealth that could buy almost anything, except me. And that was the part he couldn't bear. For the first time in his life, he couldn't dictate my choices, couldn't buy my silence, couldn't force me to bend. He had no power left over me, and that absence of power was the one defeat Himachin Saomi would never forgive. But it was also the one I would never surrender. My brother tried at first to mend what was broken. He called me one night, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it, telling me he wished things hadn't gone this far. But underneath his words was resentment, the sting of someone who had lived his entire life in the light of my father's approval, only to see it dim because of me. I listened. I even believed some part of him wanted peace. But I also knew the truth. As long as he tied his worth to my father's empire, he and I would never stand on the same side. So I let the distance remain. The company, the one my mother had locked into place for me, became my focus. I poured myself into it, not because I wanted revenge anymore, but because I wanted to build something that was mine. Clean, honest, steady. I met with employees, listened to their ideas, learned their stories. For years they had been just numbers on a balance sheet to my father, but to me they became people, faces, voices who deserved to be part of something better. Slowly, brick by brick, I began to transform the company into something that wasn't just a weapon or a pawn, but a future. My future. There were nights I still dreamed of my mother. I'd see her standing in the kitchen, humming while she cooked, her hands dusted with flour, her smile soft and tired. In those dreams, she never spoke, but when I woke up, I carried her silence like a blessing, because I knew, deep down, she had been the one to set this all in motion. She had seen who my father was. She had known what I would face. And she had left me a lifeline tucked between the lines of his empire. I hadn't understood it as a girl, but as a woman, I did. She hadn't just given me an inheritance. She had given me permission to live free. I think about legacy a lot now, the word my father worshipped. He believed legacy was about wealth, buildings, names carved into plaques. But I've learned it's not. Legacy is the courage to stand up when everyone expects you to bow down. It's the quiet strength to walk away from people who claim to love you, but only love the control they have over you. It's the power to write your own story when others try to erase you. My father's legacy will be towers of glass and steel, companies and contracts, numbers on a page. Mine will be different. Mine will be freedom, truth, and a life lived on my own terms. Sometimes I wonder if he ever lies awake at night thinking about me. If he remembers the daughter he disowned and realizes she became the one opponent he could never defeat. I'll never know. But what I do know is this. The day he told me to see his lawyer about the will was the day he thought he had ended me. Instead, it was the day I began. I no longer live in the shadow of his empire. I walk in the light of my own choices, and every step I take now carries a quiet vow to my mother, to myself. I will never again let anyone decide my worth. I will never again beg for a place at someone else's table. I built my own, and for the first time, I finally know. This is what it means to be free.